Okay, so welcome back, everyone. So it's my pleasure to introduce Desmond Elliott. So Desmond is currently associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, where he leads the language and multimodal processing group. So Desmond has extensive work on representation learning for multilingual and multimodal data in the communities, recognized as a leader in this area with best paper awards and prestigious research grants. So here in the summer school, this is actually the second time he gives a lecture on vision and language. So let's welcome Desmond.
Thanks for such an amazing introduction. I hope I can live up to it. So I'm really glad to be back here and to see so many of you at 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm not sure if I would have the same commitment, so I'm always impressed to see you here. So today we're going to talk about vision and language learning, and I'm going to start with a working definition that I hope we can agree on. Multimodal models, we're going to describe these as models that jointly process information from two or more input modalities. For example, you could have images and text, or speech and video, or text and video. And the main aim is to mash all this together in a neural network and pray that it actually works at the other side. And so why am I interested in this? There's a lot of convincing evidence that human beings ground conceptual knowledge within modality-specific and modality-agnostic processing systems in the brain. So this example here of a brain scan from a study by Pulvermuller and colleagues shows the activations in a human brain where on your left, the person is performing an action related to either their foot or their finger or their tongue. And on the right-hand side, it's when people are sitting in the same scanner, but reading about these parts of the body. And there is a co-activation of different circuits within the brain according to the scan. And I think that it's just like a super compelling argument that going into the future, our language processing system should be multimodal, since human beings are multimodal and they live in a embodied environment. From a more alternative perspective, multimodality also helps to reduce ambiguity. About 5 or 6 years ago, I saw this small sign, and if I was a state-of-the-art robot, for example, Johnny 5, I would probably be unclear about which butt I had to stick at this location. But Johnny 5 is able to see a little bit more than this. And so he can see that while it does indeed look like a seat, it is an ashtray outside of an airport. And this is the type of thing where if Johnny 5 could only see and read text, he would be unclear about what to achieve in this process. And this is part of a larger argument about what you can and cannot learn language from. So Bisk and colleagues had a really nice overview of what they call world scopes. And so most research in natural language processing and computational linguistics has been at the level of working with a text corpora, or perhaps more recently, the internet. But they argue that you cannot learn language from the radio without grounding because you lack perception. And you also cannot learn language from television without actions because you lack an embodiment. You're merely observing the world instead of taking decisions and actions within it. And finally, you also cannot really learn language without interacting with other people because you're missing a social dynamic. And I guess you might want to argue that some recently deployed large language models have jumped all the way to the social aspect of it. But I think it's difficult to argue that they're interacting with you. They're not really an interlocutor, they're just a action response system. Within multimodal learning, there are at least 5 major areas of research. There's representations that you need to use to process the data. There's translation, alignment, fusion, and co-learning. And so if we take a very quick look at these 5 major areas, there has been an enormous amount of work over the last decade in these representation learning approaches. If we go all the way back to the early 2000s, we have handcrafted features using histograms or oriented gradients. Now, in the early 2020s, we have CLIP. In terms of translation, going from one modality to another, in 2015, there was the first compelling example of using a neural net to translate from an image into a sentence using a recurrent neural network. And now we have a system that will go in the opposite direction through a conditional diffusion model, taking text as an input and trying to synthesize plausible pixel arrays from that. In terms of alignment, this is crucially important for self-supervised learning, but also phrase grounding. So trying to directly isolate and locate, in this instance, the pink elephant in the image that you see on the right-hand side. And in terms of fusion, a lot of early work studied the differences between so-called early and late fusion. But in the era of transformer-based models, we now have multi-head self-attention operating over all of the different inputs, providing us with what I call model-based fusion. So we're no longer trying to impose priors about how these representations should be learned. We're leaving it up to a massively parameterized neural net. And the final major area is of co-learning, where we would like to do some kind of transfer across modalities, perhaps taking embeddings of images and trying to project them onto a text manifold, or vice versa, or maybe even trying to learn visual representations of tokens themselves, in this example here by Mohit and his group in 2020. And the roadmap for today is that we're going to try and dive into each of these areas, some of them in more detail, some of them less. I have built this talk with the assumption that you don't know anything about vision and language learning. So if you do, that's great. You can just relax and rest for the next 3 hours. But if you don't, I'm going to try and mix a combination of giving you purely information about what's happening in the literature, and then also showing you examples of how we have used this within my research group at the University of Copenhagen. So I'm trying to kind of mix and match the level of detail that you'll get. So in part one, we're going to cover datasets and tasks, since datasets and tasks are at the core of learning from data. And particularly thinking about large language models in the future, I think this is only going to become more important. We'll talk about data representation, and then we'll talk about modeling techniques. And if everything goes to plan, by the time we reach the break, we will have finished the third section of part one. But I think this is unlikely, so we'll figure it out. And then we'll take the break, and I've been told that there's going to be a photo session during the break, and almost everyone wore their t-shirt. So that's going to be great. Then we'll come back and we'll have two more sections, one on understanding multimodal models and some speculations about future directions in the field that people are not necessarily working on yet. So all the slides are already available online. The URL was on the front page, and feel free to open it up on your laptop and annotate it while you're sitting here today. So let's dive in. Datasets and tasks. So in my opinion, there are basically two types of datasets. There are general purpose datasets where you have visual data paired with descriptive annotations. This could be an example shown here on the right-hand side. And these are typically examples where the datasets are scraped from the web. So you'll have datasets like conceptual captions or LION. On the other hand, you have more task-specific datasets where the visual data is associated maybe with classification labels for image or video captioning or question answering. And there are many different types of tasks that you can work on within vision and language learning. I've tried to create a taxonomy by myself last night. So I think that there's three main types of problems people are interested in. The first one is sequence generation. So given an image V, people want to estimate a distribution over a sequence of tokens X. And this can be for something like image captioning or video caption, or maybe visual storytelling. For image generation, obviously our conditioning variables are swapped around here. But this could still be a type of sequence generation. We could also think about classification tasks, for example, visual question answering, where you'll observe some kind of input question X and an image V, and you try to predict a distribution over answers Y. And finally, there are tasks that involve ranking or alignment, for example, image to text retrieval, or trying to localize referring expressions within images. And we can think about this as trying to measure the distance between the representations produced of an encoding of the sentence or the text and an encoding of the image. And so if we look through some of the most common data sets, I'm going to try and illustrate in the top right what I think are the most common uses of these data sets. So MS COCO is an extremely important data set in multimodal learning, and it's used both for general purpose representation induction and also for task-specific problems like image captioning or image segmentation, as you can see with all of these segmented sheep on the right-hand side. And the images here cover 80 common objects that appear in context. And these common objects are sampled from basically Flickr images collected in North America and Western Europe. And we can see an example here of the different types of sentences that human beings have written about this beautiful countryside scene. If we step away from this very carefully human-authored data, we can look at something like conceptual captions, which is commonly used for pre-training models, and it exists in either a 3 or a 12 million version with normalized English captions. So what it means to normalize is that you start on the left-hand side with an image and its alt text that if you are, for example, a company with an extremely large repository of web pages, you can trivially extract this, I believe. And so we start off with the image and it appears with a piece of text, and some of the images are deemed to be inappropriate for further processing because they're too small or their aspect ratio is incorrect. Perhaps sometimes the sentences are too vague, and the sentences that are actually potentially useful, like Demi Lovato wearing a black Esther Abner Spring 2018 gown, etc., is rewritten using a normalization process into pop rock artist wearing a black gown and sandals at awards. And this is the type of data that's used to train these vision and language models. The normalization process is not public. It is described in the paper. I tried to get a student to re-implement it, and it was extremely hard because it relies extensively on Google APIs. And due to link rot, much less of this data is currently available. So I know that we have about 11.5 million of these images. I have no idea how many you would get now. And the images are just released as a TSV file of URLs, so you also have to roll your own scraping system and have a huge hard disk to download them. So this is conceptual captions. There's an alternative approach to this called Lion, which many of you may have heard of. This is data that's also used for pre-training, and they start from Common Crawl, which is a huge initiative to snapshot the internet on a regular basis. And from this large Common Crawl resource, the researchers at Lion have several different stages of filtering the data, downloading the image text pairs from within it, and then doing content filtering in order to release the data publicly. And it's the data behind models like Stable Diffusion or OpenClip. But there are major problems with this type of approach to creating data sets. At the end of 2023, the 5 billion variant of this was removed from the internet due to it having illegal material that should not have appeared in a publicly released data set. So I think that this shows that even if you want large-scale, huge data, it doesn't always come for free, and it's not easy to do something like this in a way that's responsible. A more task-specific focused data set would be something like VQA, where the main aim is to evaluate how well systems will answer questions about images, where you have multimodal inputs in the form of an image paired with a question. We can see an example here where there's been a careful effort to try to balance the data so that you can avoid language-based priors. So the images are usually paired in a way that the model actually has to interrogate the content of the image to answer this. And you also get out of context or out of distribution examples like this kid sitting in a fridge. This is something where a model would struggle to understand this if it was just using priors it had learned from training. This is commonly tackled as a classification problem, but we are now seeing increasing efforts to view this as a language generation problem when we use larger scale models with autoregressive decoders. Another example of a commonly studied task is NLVR, which is a binary classification task where the models need to jointly reason over a pair of images and a sentence. And these are data sets with handcrafted hard negatives, so that the goal is that the models really have to demonstrate their understanding of the input data here. There's also a task called visual common sense reasoning, where we have images sampled out of TV shows and movies. And these are paired with multiple choice questions in a VQA style, covering a wide range of question types. And systems are also challenged to explain a rationale. And so in this image you see on the right-hand side, an example question would be, why is person 4 in the foreground pointing at person 1? And there are some valid answers. For example, he is telling person 3 that person 1 ordered the pancakes. That looks perfectly plausible to me. I don't think it looks like he's giving person 1 directions. And hopefully, this is the example where your model would understand that pointing is not only used to give directions, it's also used to explain something within a local context. So I think this is a super cool example of a challenging task that requires interesting reasoning. In terms of my own group, we've been doing some work on multilingual image sentence collection. We created a data set a while ago called Multi30K, which is a multilingual aligned image sentence data set in many languages. We started out with English and German. It was extended into French and Czech, Arabic, Japanese, Turkish, and most recently Ukrainian. And so we end up having this small, it's only 155,000 sentences, but parallel corpus across all these different languages, which I think if you're really interested in language and the way that different things can be expressed, it's a cool resource to think about in terms of your research. There's also this really nice Bobsil data set. Oh, you see the video, but I don't. How do I click on it if I don't see it? Never mind. So this is a data set where the University of Oxford and the BBC collaborated. Sorry? Okay. So yeah, you can see that this is collected from live broadcast TV, and this person is signing, and the aim of the task here is to do sign spotting. So given that you want to recognize a particular sign, can you localize this within a particular input? Which I think is a really great example of a task that combines vision and language learning. And there's thousands of hours of signed shows here. And I believe you can get access to this. You have to sign maybe some kind of agreement that you won't steal the BBC's data and repurpose it. Okay. How do I make you go to the next slide? Okay. Oh, this is a mess. And there are many, many more types of tasks. I could spend hours talking about these, or you can just take a look through some of these later. There's sequential image story telling, where we have to write sentences about multiple images in a sequence where they are logically connected. Also things like vision and language navigation for synthetic robots, or perhaps text-to-image generation using something like DALI eval, or abstract reasoning, something like craft or kilogram, where we have more abstract shapes that have compositional properties, and even more different types of sign language processing. And there's just so much more. But one of the things I want to argue is that there's also an emerging problem in the field of what I call binding, which you can think of as the degree of multimodality in a piece of textual data. So if we take this image of a well-known European politician, and we ask people on the internet through crowdsourcing to describe this, we might get something with what I would call strong binding, where they would write something like, a woman in a gray suit is giving a speech. They might not even know who this woman is. It would depend on your particular background and cultural knowledge. Whereas the actual sentence that we find that alt texts this image on the internet still doesn't tell us anything about who this woman is. In fact, it's more a sentence about the event at which she gave a speech. And maybe this gives you an even clearer example of why the conceptual captions dataset relied on this normalization step. If you try to learn representations of visually grounding the world from the sentence on the left, I don't even know how you ground this into the image, because I can't. And that's because there are many different types of purposes for these sentences. And it's been shown in a wide number of contexts that rewriting these crawl texts can vastly improve the performance of models in downstream tasks. But I think that there's also going to become a point in the near future where the tasks we want to work on actually require processing and understanding text on the left rather than text on the right. There are also ethical issues with collecting data. I already touched on this when I spoke about the problem with the Lion 5B dataset. But multimodal datasets are increasingly being scraped from the web with unknown degrees of conformance about the licensing of the underlying data. And as of 2022, there were at least 2.5 billion Creative Commons licensed objects online. But these are not just images. This is things like research datasets or web pages. I guess for those of you that are going to publish papers in academic conferences, your papers might be Creative Commons licensed in the future. And this does allow people to redistribute these objects, but it's unclear about when you take a data set with URLs from conceptual captions and you download them, what the licensing is on that. And if you have commercial applications in mind, this is a serious issue and a serious concern. And there's also a major problem with scale, which is that scale makes it easy for you to build systems that will perpetuate harmful stereotypes. We've seen this across natural language processing, and surprisingly, it's not going to disappear with multimodality. This is an image of Eileen Collins, a famous American astronaut. If we use the CLIP model to encode this photograph and these two different sentences, one of them is very accurate description of Eileen Collins. This is an astronaut standing next to an American flag. CLIP thinks that this is less of a match than an image that stereotypes this woman into being a housewife in an orange jumpsuit, as if anybody would wear this orange jumpsuit in the household. And so the thing I'd like to discuss now in more detail is how can we collect multimodal data that better reflects the diversity of the world? And we've done some research in this back in 2021 on this attempt to collect visually grounded reasoning data across different languages and cultures. And our motivation for this is that at the time, and I think honestly, even still now, most of the vision and language and data exists in English or some high resource Indo-European languages. The images are typically sourced from ImageNet, a large and very important database of images. But if we look at the geolocation of the images in ImageNet, they cluster around North America and Western Europe. And so the implications for vision and language models is that it makes it difficult for us to understand their real world understanding and comprehension because we have such a narrow linguistic or visually distributional domain. And this, just to remind you, if you haven't known about ImageNet, it's this massive database where it's structured according to WordNet hierarchy. And so it's millions of labeled images, I think 21 million in total. And we have these really fine-grained annotations on the type of entity within an image. It's typically used to train visual encoders. And after you have this, you can then use it to maybe work with a data set like Coco. We described this about 5 minutes ago, which is based on these 80 types of commonly occurring objects. But we think that you can do better than this. And our background for starting on this is that some concepts are most immediately understood within cultural contexts. If we define culture as the way of life of a collective of people that distinguishes them from others, then we can take a sample of 3 images and try to determine if we actually know what these represent. So we take the first image here on the left. Does anybody know what this is? It is. Great. It's pilota or it's jai alai, depending on your cultural context. I recently watched a YouTube video of this, and I don't know why people play this game. It seems to be terrifying, and I genuinely don't get this. Does anybody know the object depicted in the second image? So we have one option, which is it's a Japanese instrument. Anybody know something more specific? No? I think I heard somebody whisper the answer. Yes. But I also got in some trouble because apparently the label you apply to this instrument depends on whether you think about this from a Chinese or a Japanese perspective. So I had to update my slides to include both of these labels. Does anybody know what the image on the right depicts? Yes, it is indeed fire. It's great that we're getting these answers because it will illustrate my next point perfectly. So this is a traditional festival that happens 6 miles from my hometown. At the start of the year, a group of people are selected and have the privilege of carrying a bar of burning tar through the streets. I don't know why this is a privilege. It seems about as terrifying as Pilota. But these are concepts where it's really difficult to understand what they are if you don't know the background that they come from. And this is not a new problem. I'm not going to claim I'm the first person to think about this. There is a very, very long history of people thinking about categories and concepts. And I particularly ascribe to Roche's view that categories form this hierarchy in which we have basic level categories, and above that we have superordinate and subordinate categories. And we saw a great example of basic level category naming. It was indeed fire. But with cultural knowledge, the subordinate would be that it's the clavy. It's a more specific thing. And that some concepts have universal representations across different languages, but there are definitely effects of familiarity of individuals. For example, some people knew it was pilota, or some people knew it was a shamisen. Whereas I would also be as naive to say it's a stringed musical instrument. And so one thing you can ask yourself is, are ImageNet concepts cross-lingual, given that they're at the backbone of training so many vision and thus multimodal models? And in order to estimate this cross-linguality, we use Wikipedia as a proxy. So what this means is we'll take a concept or a synset. This is how you describe the labeling of ImageNet. And we find the existence of this in the English Wikipedia. And then we look across Wikipedias in different languages and see if there are linked articles in those languages. So in this instance, we may find one in Italian and we may find one in Tamil. So this gives us the notion that it's somewhat cross-lingual, but we do not find this concept in Chinese. And if we take a look at the distribution here, where the y-axis is the absolute count and the x-axis is the number of languages covered per synset, then we can see that most concepts appear in less than 30 languages, and there are very few universal concepts that you can find through this approximation of mining Wikipedia. So the basis of training vision and language models is not cross-lingual, as estimated by this. And can we do better? So we wanted to create a data set for multicultural reasoning where the images are representative of the annotations of different cultures. And we collected this over 5 typologically diverse languages. We have Indonesian, Swahili, Turkish, Mandarin Chinese, and Tamil. And this is one of the rare examples of a concept that's aligned across these 5 languages, showing the visual distribution of basketball within these different settings, played indoors or outdoors in different combinations. And the data that we tried to collect here was for visual reasoning. So the data point that you get is a pair of images, V1 and V2, and a sentence. And the aim is to predict whether the sentence is a true description of that pair of images. And the sentences do not exist in translated versions into English. So you have to directly process the text in Tamil in this case. But you can also use machine translation if you want to. So how do we do this? Well, we tried to do something innovative here and do this through a native speaker-driven protocol in 3 different stages. Our first step, or step 0, was to decide which concepts we wanted to collect data for. We used the Intercontinental Dictionary series, and we focused on the chapters that contain concrete objects and events. And this was the bias we introduced into the data collection process. From there, we asked native speakers to give us lists of language-specific concepts related to a particular chapter within the dictionary series. And they should be commonly seen or representative, and ideally, they should be a physical or a concrete object instead of an abstract notion. If we take sport as an example, then within this semantic field, we ask a collection of native speakers to find pages on their Wikipedia in their language that represent this concept. This is another bias we introduce. I have no evidence that there was a side effect of people writing Wikipedia articles in order to have this concept in the data set. And from this, we extract the top 5 per semantic field. And this gives us approximately 90 concepts per language. And if we take a look at the overview of them, for each of the languages, there's between 10 to 25% of concepts that have no relation into the English word net, which means that their representation is unlikely to have been learned at all. So we're already going to be creating data that will do something quite fundamentally different in our modeling space. After we have these concepts, we then want to collect images because we're interested in vision and language learning after all. And this is also performed by native speakers where the image should ideally contain more than one instance of the concept. For example, these bounty of cauliflowers, or perhaps the object should be interacting with other objects in the image. For example, this act of preparing buttermilk collected by Tamil speakers. Also, we should probably have an instance where the concept is performing an activity. This is an example here from Swahili of a particular type of shovel. Or maybe it should be displayed with a more diverse set of objects. This is an example here of raki, which I believe is a very strong alcoholic drink consumed in Turkey. If we had collected just an image of a bottle of raki, this wouldn't tell us much about what this drink is commonly associated with. But now here we can see some other food type objects and that you might eat it whilst looking at a nice view over a city. After we've collected all these images, which are, by the way, Creative Commons licensed, we made this very important as part of our data process. We then need to annotate this with sentences. Once again, it's written by native speakers. The way we do this is for a given concept within a semantic field, we pair 4 images at random, and we ask a human being to write a sentence that's true for only 2 pairs of these images. For example, they might pick these 2 image pairs on the right-hand side, and they'll write a sentence. We then have a different annotator validate the accuracy of this image sentence pair. And if it's correct, it's great. Otherwise, we go back and we try to collect more data. And then there's a final validation where we try to make sure the data is as clean and as accurate as possible. And from this, we have a very reproducible process where we have an inter-annotator agreement of 93% according to Fleiss-Kappa. We can also take a look at some examples of the data. This is a pair of images, and the gloss into English from Turkish is that in one of the images, there are multiple people with cannons on their knees. Is this true or false? It's false. Okay, why? The what? The objects seem to have legs of their own. That's a kind of fine-grained reasoning that I'm not sure I can get on board with that. I believe that the two women on the left have the object resting on their knees, but the real question is whether this is a canon, or even if I can pronounce this word correctly. The label is true, and I had to learn about a new type of instrument in order to understand this.
Variation. So it would be the table and just a small board with the strings.
There's some cultural knowledge that I did not possess. So here's another example where we have two images, and the gloss into English is that both images contain a lot of masala vadas. Is this true or false? It's false. Why is it false? I can't hear you. Um,
The dish is vada. Yeah, hence the label is false.
yeah, this was something where if you don't know about a particular food culture that's being depicted here, you may believe that vada could apply to different types of objects and it may look differently. But I think that if you're a Tamil speaker or if you're familiar with Indian food culture, this is obviously false to you. You know it straight away. Did you know this immediately? Yes, it was obvious to you. I had to look this up online and do some careful interrogation. So given that we have this data set of these image pairs with sentences across different languages, we can ask ourselves, how would we model this and what might we do with it? So we need a multilingual model that can process the text, but it also needs to be a visually grounded model. And we created two variants for this. One of them we called M-Uniter and one we called X-Uniter. This was back in 2021, based on whether the language backbone of the model was MBERT or XLM Roberta. And the models we created performed similarly to English-only models, even though they had multilingual encoders in the backbone. And so we were convinced that we had created a multilingual model that was at least a similar performance to an English-only model using something like BERT as its representation. And then when we try to evaluate this directly in our dataset Marvel, the results are terrible. Absolutely rubbish. The zero-shot ability of the model to process the sentence image pairs in Mandarin Chinese or Tamil, Swahili, Indonesian, or Turkish, the best performance you can get is about 56% accuracy in Turkish. The rest of, it's a binary task. The performance is at random. And so we were convinced that we had created a task where this was a really major challenge for vision and language models. So one of the things that we wanted to find out is whether these zero-shot performance results were so bad because we had poor cross-lingual multimodal binding. And to address this, we translated a huge amount of multimodal text, so image sentence pairs, into many different languages. We used an off-the-shelf translation system. We used M2M 100, which at the time in 2022 was a very performant model. We used the 500 million parameter version. It took us about 3 weeks of non-stop decoding, which infuriated many people in the lab, in order to create all of this translated data. We had to filter it because so much of it was noisy nonsense that you couldn't use. And then at the end, we did increase performance by like 3 or 4 points. So that was thrilling to see that the low zero-shot performance was partially caused by this lack of high quality binding. And then if we accelerate forward in time, then the supervised state of the art is now represented by a model called mBlip, where it's a model that's initialized from a model called BLIP2, and it has an MT0 extra large language model in its representation. And then they used the NLLB translation model to pre-train on translations into 96 different languages of some very large data sets, for example, MS COCO, a CAP filtered data set, VQA data sets. And from this, they only try to update very small parts of the model, like LoRa adaptation in the LLM, and also some of the representations in what's called the Q-former and the projection layer in the image encoder. The zero-shot state of the art is a model called PalyGemma, which was released very recently. It's initialized from a Gemma 2B language model and an image encoder called SIGLIP, and it's pre-trained on a huge amount of data. Something called web language image, which is extremely vaguely described by Google. But I know that it's probably at least 10 billion data points. And then there's also machine translated versions of data sets like conceptual captions or VQA, and also a large data set of Wikipedia image text pairs. And what we see, if we look at this, is steady year-on-year improvements in trying to solve this problem. There is a clear benefit when you use machine translated data. This was going from 2021 to 2022. And then when we take this forward into 2023 and we use some of the advances that you find from state-of-the-art large language models and better visual encoders, the performance jumps up substantially. And now at 2024 with PalyGemma, with all the data that Gemma is trained on and billions of data points used to estimate the multimodal model, we can get zero-shot performance of 80%, but we still aren't anywhere near the human level performance on this data. So I think that there's still some work to be done here. And I also think that this is, I hope you see this as an example of a way you can collect a multimodal data set that respects the different representation of humans within it and also their cultures and backgrounds. It doesn't always have to be large scale scraping. And I think this is especially important when it comes to preparing evaluation data sets. And I believe that in the future, we'll see a lot more effort to try to very carefully collect data sets that are not machine generated or machine altered in any way. So moving on to part 2, we're going to talk about data representation. We've already kind of talked about this because I spoke about the encoding of data, but we're going to move into this in a little bit more detail. Basically, there are 3 levels of representation. There's the perceptual representation, pre-processed features, and raw inputs. And I'm showing some examples here. On the left-hand side, we have these perceptual representations. The cool histogram of oriented gradients in the middle, this is a representation of the image on the right-hand side. Maybe those of you at the back can make out the wheels on the vehicle. Perceptual norms are typically collected by asking people to write down words that are triggered by textual stimuli. So McRae and colleagues did this for a collection of 541 nouns. And this is an example here where the stimuli is moose. And the information they elicited from people was, for example, that a moose is large, or that a moose has 4 legs, or that a moose is hunted by people, or that it's eaten as meat, or that it is a herbivore. And in addition to information about the types of distribution over these norms, we also have information about what type of knowledge is needed to know this about an input. So is it about the visual form? Is it about the function of the animal? Is it some kind of encyclopedic knowledge? I don't think that people have really tapped into this as an interesting case of, can our models be used to create this type of data automatically? And if I had to summarize these representations, I would say that the pros are that this is seemingly a pretty simple task for humans to perform. If we had enough money and people were bored enough, we could sit and do this for many, many types of concepts. But I don't really think it scales in the end, because it's difficult to imagine it handling things like ambiguity or abstract concepts. And there's also got to be a question about, what does it mean to understand symbols when you only define those symbols in terms of other symbols? Coming back to some of the historical argument from Searle and many of his colleagues. Then we think about features that are extracted in a pre-processed form from images. So the earliest work in the neural network era used either pooling or spatially preserving features in a convnet. And we could take a model like this. So if you've seen something like the AlexNet model, you probably recognize this representation. And if you see a paper which talks about somebody using pooled features, you'll see a sentence typically like this, where CNN of I transforms the pixels inside the bounding box into 4,096 dimensional activations of the fully connected layer immediately before the classifier. That's over there, right there at the end. Whereas if somebody was using spatial features, it would say something like, in our experiments, we use the 14 by 14 by 512 feature map of the 4th convolutional layer. In this image, it's a poor map because it's actually 256 dimension feature. But just imagine it says 512 and we'll move on. This is an example where they were working with features where the inputs could be localized to particular parts of the image instead of just having a flat pooled representation of the output. In terms of other types of pre-processed features, people started to heavily rely on region-based features, where a very popular model called Faster RCNN was trained on something called the visual genome dataset. And then on top of this, there's a region proposal network that suggests within the image where might there be regions of interest. And then within those regions of interest, a CNN gives a single feature vector that represents that, instead of representing it in the image as a whole. And so if you see this within a paper, you might read something like this. Our models are trained with 36 regions of interest. That's those things, extracted from a faster RCNN backbone. That's down there at the bottom. This is the thing that's actually extracting these 2,000 dimension vectors from the representation. If you think about the pros and cons here, this was at the time a very well and long established practice. And it's usually offline. So you do it once and you forget about it. You take up GPUs for 2 or 3 weeks while doing it, and everyone hates you, but then it's done. And the cons of this was actually a little bit more involved, because you eventually need to develop specialized data storage and processing techniques. So you had to rely on things like H5 in order to process the data. And it was not obvious how to do random augmentation, which is known to be at the heart of successful visual processing. And some of the specialist knowledge that's required here. Am I hearing myself? Cool. So some of the specialist knowledge was a bit opaque to newcomers, and that's why I've tried to give you examples taken directly from scientific papers and relating them to where this occurs within the model. Moving on more recently, we have this idea of working with raw input. where we process data directly from raw images, or maybe if you're doing speech processing, from the speech signal. For images, we might be using something like a vision transformer, or more a SWIN transformer, which does some compression of the input space. For speech recognition, you might use audio May or a spectrogram transformer. And after Danke's great lecture yesterday, you're already almost an expert in how the vision transformer works. And so what happens is you take an image and you split it into K patches, and you embed each patch and you add positional information. And then it goes through a transformer block and it looks almost the same as everything you learned yesterday, but there's an extra pre-norm layer, so a layer normalization before the multi-head self-attention. And that's it. Now you know everything you need to know about vision transformers in a nutshell. And they can be used in pretty much the same way as convnets. You can extract pooled features, or you can extract region or patch level features. So if you see a paper that's working with pooled features, you might see to extract visual information from the image, we use a visual encoder pre-trained on CLIP. That's it. CLIP gives you this one summary vector that represents the image in its CLS output embedding. Whereas if you're using patch level features, it might say something like, we extract the feature grid before the pooling layers, resulting in a grid. It's telling you exactly what the inputs and outputs are here. And so in this case, data augmentation is pretty straightforward because you're always working directly from the raw pixels. So if you want to do random cropping or color manipulation or flipping it around the axes, this is indeed possible. And because there are fewer pre-processing steps, you'll have fewer creeping errors where you've suddenly wasted lots of GPU time extracting data. But as these vision transformer models get larger and larger, you need to devote more space on the GPU to actually processing this data. And I don't know about you, but I don't have access to a wide army of A100s. I certainly don't have access to any H100s. And another problem that you'll experience is that you can have potentially many, many, many inputs just to represent your image. So you have to be careful about this. Otherwise, you have 576 inputs to represent your image, and you have a sentence of 8 words. It's pretty difficult to imagine a model being able to process that effectively. And so the summary of this data processing part is that there are so many different options for how you could represent multimodal data. It could be language oriented. It could be based on objects, like using faster RCNN, or stuff in images like sky and fields. Or more recently, you could take the approach to just working with raw input data. And there is no universally best option here. It all depends on the task you're working on. But I think raw inputs are showing some promise as a good approach for most tasks, because the visual encoding can be fully differentiable if you have the GPU RAM to hold the data. So moving on to the third part, which is modeling. There are 3 main approaches in the literature: what I call dual or cross encoding, cross attention, and visual prefix learning. The cross encoding models emerged as a key approach to language and vision processing in 2019 with Larry, like 10 models almost simultaneously, trying to create visually grounded BERT models. And this is model-based fusion. Instead of early fusion or late fusion, this is where you let the model fuse the features together. And you typically have a system which consists of a language encoder and a visual encoder, and then maybe some model-specific layers that are randomly initialized on top. There are typically, at this time, 2 ways of viewing it. There's single stream models where you concatenate all of the inputs together. This is shown here at the top, where you have your input text, and then you have your image embedding representations, and you have transformer layers that perform multi-head self-attention between all of the inputs simultaneously, producing richly contextualized multimodal outputs. At the same time as these single stream approaches, there were dual stream approaches where you have modality specific processing. What this means is that over here on the bottom, you have K layers of multi-head self-attention only within each modality. So you could imagine that the image embeddings are only attending to the image embeddings and vice versa for the language embeddings. And then researchers developed representations and structures in the model where the models would transfer features across modalities and then go back to doing within modality representation learning. And these would be stacked over and over L different times. So what did this look like in practice? One of the first models here was called Vilbert, which was a dual stream model. Remember, dual stream on the bottom. It was initialized from BERT, and they used visual features from between 10 to 36 regions using the faster RCNN model, which we just covered in the previous section. And the model was pre-trained on conceptual captions. That's the Google dataset with 3 million examples. For 3 pre-training tasks, there was masked language modeling, masked region classification, and image text matching. And in the masked region classification, they used the probability distribution over the object labels that faster RCNN wanted to predict. And the idea was that the model would have to predict that distribution. Given what the inputs were observed in. And you can see here this whole like K layers and L layers of transformer specific representations for one modality versus cross-modal representation. This was all the rage. And there's also this image text matching objective where given an image and sentence pair, the model has to predict whether they are aligned. This is basically like the next sentence prediction that we covered yesterday. Sorry, Danke covered yesterday. For all of the time that we worked with these kind of dual encoding methods, keeping this equivalent version of next sentence prediction was crucial for model performance. There never was this occasion like with Roberta where it became obvious that you didn't need this anymore. We can move a bit forward in time to a model called VILT, which was a single stream model, once again initialized from BERT. But in this case, the visual features were patch-based using a vision transformer. They were initialized from a vision transformer that worked on 32 by 32 pixel patches. And it was pre-trained on a combination of data sets, giving them 4 million pre-training data points, which sounds really, really small compared to the data even being used at the time to train language models like BERT and Roberta and XLNet. And once again, the tasks are quite familiar from the previous model. We have math language modeling, the image text matching, and then they had a word patch alignment objective where they tried to perform optimal transport between these different representations. In 2022, there was a model called Flava, which became much more explicit about the different modeling aspects and the different responsibilities. And so there are dual stream processes here with visual features, once again, now coming from a visual transformer. And it was pre-trained on 70 million data points, which were also publicly distributed, where there are different components going on here. So the image encoder has image-specific pre-training tasks. The language encoder has language-specific pre-training tasks. And then the multimodal transformer at the top has multimodal-specific pre-training tasks. And what the authors showed with this approach is that you could then use things like the image encoder alone or the text encoder alone, in addition to learning a good multimodal model. And this was quite an exciting advance at the time. An alternative to this kind of cross-representation learning is dual encoding methods, which emerged as a sample-efficient alternative where the backbone in this approach consists of 2 separate components, the language encoder and the visual encoder, and this is it. There's no cross-representation learning. And one of the most commonly known representations in this is CLIP, which uses a transformer encoder for language representations and either a vision transformer or a ResNet visual encoder to represent the image data. And the model was trained to maximize the similarity of the embeddings of paired examples along the diagonal while minimizing the similarity of the diagonal. And there was a huge pre-training data set of, I think, about 400 million examples. It was very difficult to understand in the paper at the time, and even now, exactly how OpenAI collected this data set. But we do have attempts to recreate things like this, like OpenClip, using more clearly provenanced web scale data. More recently, we have seen models using things like learned cross-attention. I think one of the first examples I can say of this is the Flamingo approach by DeepMind, where the model has a large language model, which is a decoder-only autoregressive language model. And the model was trained with interleaved image text pairs, as shown on the side here. And then within this large language model, there were gated cross-attention layers where the model could not only do self-attention within the inputs, it could also attend into the visual representations to try to fuse this data just in time whilst taking advantage of everything that had been learned through language model pre-training. And the visual prefix learning, this is similar to what Danke told you yesterday, where we have this approach that we have a large language model on the right-hand side. So this is from a model called Frozen at NeurIPS 2021. And in addition to just having this frozen language model, they also had a vision encoder which produced a variable number of outputs. In this case, I think it was just 2. And they only learned the representation of a mapping layer for this visual encoder. And this has now become a very common approach to fusing visual representations into language models. On the left-hand side here, we have a visualization of what happens in the LAVA model for visual instruction tuning. And it's the same thing. What they're learning here is a projection into embedding space. And so this brings us all the way up to what I will call current vision and language models so that the slide doesn't become antiquated. Most of these models follow a similar blueprint, which is you will choose pre-trained modality-specific components, and then you will define a learnable bridge between them. You will find a data set somewhere to help you estimate the parameters in this bridge, and you will also have to adopt a multi-stage fine-tuning and training strategy. So what does this look like? I've taken 4 representative models here. I know there are more, and I might not have included your favorite model, but that's okay. So we've got LAVA, we've got the Quan VL, the MM1 model, and PalyGemma. And one thing that immediately stands out to me is that they're all vision transformer-based models. All of them, and they typically tend to be operating at small pixel resolutions for each patch, usually about 14 by 14. So this is going to give us a lot of inputs into our model. The language models that are being used are a little bit all over the place. So we have up to 13 billion parameters in one instance, or all the way down to a 1.3 billion parameter model that it doesn't seem to be pre-trained from data that I could readily understand in the MM1 scientific paper. The one thing I'm going to highlight here from that slide is the SIGLIP image encoder from DeepMind. And this was pre-trained not using the contrastive learning approach from CLIP, but instead they used a sigmoid loss. And so this means it doesn't need this global view over pairwise similarities and dissimilarities, which just makes it much more sample efficient, as shown down here in the bottom, where you can get much better performance at all of the small batch sizes. I mean, if you have enough compute to put 300,000 image sentence pairs on your GPUs, then you don't have the same problems that we're going to have in university labs and other situations. But this is a really, really great technique. In terms of the learnable bridge, well, LAVA and PalyGemma use the same thing, which is a single linear layer, which is going to map the image output embeddings from the vision transformer into the language model embedding space. And this is the only thing you typically estimate. The Quan VL model uses a vision language adapter, which takes all of the image output embeddings and puts them through a transformer, in this case, through a cross-attention layer. And the goal is that you have a set of what are called learnable query vectors. I'm showing an example here from a paper called MAPL by Magnas and colleagues from EACL last year, you can define the number of learnable queries that you want the model to produce. So in this case, you could say, I only have GPU RAM for 16 output embeddings. So even if you give me 500 inputs, you're going to have to compress this down. And this is something, in this case for Qwen, they use 256 as their learnable query length, which is going to be much less than maybe the 1,000 inputs that the vision transformer produces. And for MM1, they use a convolutional abstractor. So you have a ResNet block, and then there's an adaptive pool, which decides where to pool spatial features across a set of inputs, followed by another ResNet block. Although the MM1 article and the PalyGemma article, they do a lot of ablation analysis to find out which of these components are actually important and necessary. And the linear layer is just like super efficient in terms of how you can train it and use it, especially if you want to work with a huge amount of data, which is what we are increasingly seeing. So the simplest one to describe is Lava. It uses 500,000 image caption samples filtered from conceptual captions, whereas models like Qwen use 1 billion examples, where it's an English-Chinese bilingual model. MM1 uses more than 2 billion examples covering different types of image text tasks, including things like OCR data. And PalyGemma uses 1 billion examples of multilingual image captions, VQA, in the wild datasets, and OCR data in order to estimate this bridge. And the larger models here are also trained with in-house data. So things like the Webley dataset, which is at least 1 billion examples, or MM1, which is at least 1 billion examples. I guess we could get an approximation to this if we used something like Lion or something related to that, but these are huge scales of in-house only data. And in terms of how this data is processed, typically the text is encoded using the existing language tokenizer, and the image is encoded using whichever vision transformer they want to put into the stack. Sometimes these models can work with multi-image sequences, and there's usually image position embeddings that are specific to where this image occurs in the sequence. More recently, the PalyGemma report also reports the use of location and segmentation embeddings, which are jointly learned and can be used, for example, to directly localize something within an image. So if you say to PalyGemma, highlight the dog in this image, it will try to predict the bounding box coordinates, and it does this using these tokens that are jointly learned through its fine-tuning on its billions of data points. The training strategy of Qwen, PalyGemma, and MM1 are pretty much similar. There are nuances, but I took this visualization from the Qwen paper because it's really clear. So there are multi-stage training. First of all, you have your frozen language model. It could be Gemma in this case, if it was the PalyGemma model. And there's some kind of learnable property within your model. In this case, it could be cross-attention, or it could just be this visual prefix. And you work here with low resolution images. So this is typically 224 by 224. And you freeze the language model while you learn the bridge and maybe updating the visual encoder itself. Then you typically have this multitask pre-training where you have many different tasks within your task mixture. And this is something that Sarah spoke about last night, the importance of doing multitask pre-training so that your model learns a distribution over different possible tasks when you come to use it in downstream scenarios. And in this case, in Qwen, all of the components within the model are now differentiable and updated for each of the examples. And this is where the image data gets really large scale. You may be working at maybe 700 pixels, where if you split that into 14 by 14 patches, now you have a huge number of inputs that you're going to process. And then there could also be a supervised fine-tuning stage at the end where now you freeze the visual encoder and you only update the representations in the language model and the learnable bridge. There are many different variations on this, and It's not typically something I will imagine people doing within university labs with a couple of GPUs under their desk. I think that we're a little bit far away from that already. But I do think that there's some really exciting, interesting questions here. So how quickly are we going to see this transition to smaller models? We've seen this happening almost year on year. Slav Petrov also spoke about this a few nights ago, where we're seeing this tenfold reduction in language model technology transferring into smaller models. How quickly will we see this in the multimodal space? You can also ask yourself things like, do large multimodal models need 1 billion examples to learn this bridge? The PalyGemma paper argues you do, and that you get much better cross-task transfer, but 1 billion examples is a lot of data. It's kind of scary. And we also see some really nice ablations in both the MM1 article and the PalyGemma article. So the top image here is showing the task normalized evaluation measure as you vary the image resolution. So if your models are only working at 224 by 224, you are giving up a huge amount of performance that you could achieve. And it's quite clear that going up to maybe 448 or 672 is a huge gain here. And on the right-hand side, we also have the average normalized evaluation metric, as in the number of steps you train for. It's quite clear here that training for longer really improves performance across a wide variety of different tasks. Whereas if we look at the PalyGemma ablations, we can see they dive even deeper into the issue of image resolution, and they break it down into resolution sensitive tasks. So this could be things like localizing objects within images, or doing OCR, where being able to really process the data at high quality resolution, it clearly improves performance. Whereas when you have resolution insensitive tasks, maybe like answering whether the person in the image is holding a hat, you don't need high resolution data. But maybe if you want to recognize whether the canon is sitting on the floor or on someone's legs, maybe that would be a resolution sensitive task. And so I think in summary here, if I was to give an overview of the modeling advances we've seen in the last 5 years, cross-encoding has given us huge benefits. It was the same thing that happened with BERT and language model pre-training. And we've seen many advances in understanding of which parts of different loss functions are important for training these models. And we're also seeing a very clear shift from working with regions of interest from pre-trained representations that are extracted using faster RCNN to vision transformers everywhere. We've also, hopefully, you've seen some of these approaches where you can squish the number of outputs using things like these learnable queries. Dual encoding, as popularized by CLIP in the multimodal space, has shown really excellent cross-domain transfer to a wide range of problems, not only in the multimodal space, but vision-only processing as well. And in terms of visual prefix learning or cross-attention learning, we're now seeing the advantages of exploiting the huge amount of carbon that big tech companies are investing into pre-training language models or vision encoders by themselves. So the next part of the talk is going to be a deep dive into thinking about whether image captioning models need to learn everything in weights. I can probably do this in 10 minutes and then we can take a break. Yeah? Okay. We're going to speed run this part so we can get to coffee. Or maybe I should take some questions. I haven't had any opportunity for questions, and I see people immediately throwing their hands up. So you've been sitting patiently.
Thank you. 2 questions, not for yes and no, but just for we all rethinking, because you mentioned some restrictions that we have working. One is with the open access. You mentioned the ethical issues. I would like to know better how this impacts, because if that extra layer of difficulty, it really pays off in terms of being recognized, the scalability, retesting, and the other is how we don't terrify our main centers in terms of cost to research, in terms of living for 3 weeks, the experiments running, what we need to do, better cooperation, partnerships outside academia, because there's a cost of research, and we never know if we're going to achieve something or not. But if we don't try it, of course we will not. And that's why we are there, is for publishing more better results. Thank you.
So I'm going to have to ask some clarification, so please keep the mic. For your first question, you asked about the ethical issues with regard to recognition. Can you say what you mean by that? Because I don't know how to interpret that.
I mean, in terms of using only data that is available for open access, you put an extra layer of difficulty in your work, but then you also get a work that is more easily traceable. We can see what was
Thanks
used.
for the clarification. So let's be reasonably clear. When you read some of the technical reports coming out of big tech labs, and they talk about private in-house data of 1 billion plus examples, that's about as untransparent and clear as you can possibly be. And yet it's also quite clear that these models are very high quality in terms of their performance. I know as much as you do about how these data sets are collected. And that's why we also see some initiatives like data comp. I haven't mentioned data comp yet, but it's an attempt to use publicly distributable image text datasets to learn models at different compute budgets. So they have challenges at different levels. For example, I can afford to train on 3 million examples, or I can afford to train on 100 million examples, or 1 billion examples. So I think that this answer is going to actually roll directly into your second question, which is we can try to find meaningful contributions to science at these different scales of processing. Whether or not some of the abilities of these models are also observable at smaller scales is up for debate. Within the language modeling literature, the initial claim was that emergent properties only happened at mega scale models of 7 billion plus. I know that Sarah said yesterday that she thought 13 billion was a small model, but I disagree. I think 13 billion parameters is pretty big. And I can't really imagine using that on my laptop without annoying myself. But I think that, so I know that there's a paper from David Samuel from the University of Oslo, which was pre-printed to arXiv just a few weeks ago, in which he imagines an alternative world in which we didn't all move to autoregressive language models, and instead we stuck with BERT-style architectures. And he claims that you can also get things like nice in-context learning and emergent properties from slightly scaled up models based on DiBerta. So I think that the opportunities are there. How you stop this from annoying your colleagues, you just have to be kind.
Okay, thank you for I'm here. I know it's difficult to find who's talking. So you mentioned some difficulties in data collection and annotation. And I can't help but wonder, like, in the context of web design, accessibility requires that images are described quite extensively. Is this something that the field makes use of in terms of just existing data that is already annotated in some way?
So I think that this is some of the inspiration for people trying to scrape images from the web and harvesting them along with their alt texts. But I think that the information that is included in the alt text. Hold on, are you talking about the alt text field, or is this something else in the W3?
It's basically when websites are adapted for visually impaired people, for example. They cannot see the image, so it needs to be really described. So it's not like the example that you gave from the woman in the gray jacket or whatever the description was. It's more precise, like it tells exactly what is in there. For example, woman standing on a stage talking about an event or something.
So I think if that's really widespread on the internet.
Not so much. There are, for example, newspapers that do that more extensively, but sometimes it's better or worse quality depending on who's doing it.
And I guess this is also why organizations like Twitter want you to write the alt text when you upload an image. They want you to write a description of it. Because they're not going to do it themselves since it's user-generated data. So I think that type of data would be super useful. I can also imagine newspapers being really annoyed machine learning researchers seeing this data on the web and thinking, well, that looks pretty free. So I'm just going to take it. I can see the benefit of this data, especially if it's available in high quality and high volumes. And it's also maybe multilingually available since there are newspapers all around the world. It sounds like an amazing resource. I just think we could get in a lot of trouble and we'd have to pretend that we weren't using it.
All right, thank you.
Thanks.
Hello, up here. First of all, thank you very much for a super nice talk.
Hello.
Lecture. My question, whose answer may be super obvious, but hopefully you can help me, is like, especially in these super large settings of many parameters and especially a lot of data, is there actually an ablation on what would happen if the benchmark test data would be introduced in this super large training data set? Would they reach 100%, 80%? Wouldn't we like get to know the cap of the capacity the models could learn? Is there an ablation, or do people do this? Probably not, because the training takes so long and you wouldn't train twice, just one time with and one time without the test benchmark data, but maybe you know something about this. Thanks.
Yeah, that would be a huge waste of carbon, right? So I know that when we did some work back in 2021 on smaller scale models, we worked really hard to deduplicate images from the pre-training that would actually occur in the fine-tuning data. Even though the image did not occur with the same label, for example, it was just a generic sentence, we didn't even want the model to have seen this. I think there are some examples from some earlier work where people were not always that careful and some of the images accidentally snuck in, but they didn't sneak in with the task-specific labels. So the exact setting you're describing has not been observed. Maybe somebody has done this experiment subsequently, but I think that there's a limit to what you could expect. You would have done some kind of visual modeling of the data. So it would probably help since you're working with the distribution that you need to generalize to. I think it's a good question. I'd also like to think about how you could justify the compute of doing this.
Thank you very much.
So I wanted to ask you about the Marvel dataset. How much how many resources and how much time it took to create everything, I guess, because you participated in the process?
It took about 1.5 months and 5,000 euros to collect it for 5 languages. And we needed language experts within the project who were able to be involved and to kind of assure the quality of the data that we were collecting. And I know it took a lot of back and forth with different annotators. We were working with a platform called Prolific, which is a much better place than Amazon Mechanical Turk to try to target speakers of different languages. For example, maybe you know this already, in Prolific, you can filter it by location and education level and many different properties that you'd like to achieve. And then sometimes it says, okay, there are 4 people on the platform that you can reach out to, which is when it takes a really long time to collect data. But mostly we were working with a pool of 200 plus annotators.
Thank you.
And all of the data and the processing and everything, it's all publicly available. So we also have the steps that we took and the filtering we did and the decisions we made. And so if you thought about trying to recreate this for your own language, the blueprint for how to do this is there. I think you could also maybe reduce the cost from $1,000 per language. I don't think it needs to be that high. We paid quite a generous amount of money because we were asking people to perform quite specialized tasks. But if in a university setting, you happen to be teaching a class, then you can coerce the students in exchange for extra credit in their coursework. I mean, that sounds very corrupt. But I think that there are less expensive ways to achieve the same output. I now see that we have run over time, and I see that there's still some questions, but there's also this photo shoot. So should we stop and I can continue to talk to people in the coffee break? Yeah? Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. You're recaffeinated. We're looking forward to seeing all the great photos. I'm going to dive into another piece of research from the group, which is based on a pretty straightforward question. Does an image captioning model need to learn everything in weights? So this appeared at NACL 2024 in Mexico about 2 weeks ago. For those of you who were in Mexico, I hope you had a great time. I did. It was awesome. So this line of work is based on the idea of retrieval augmented generation, which we've heard discussed a few times in the summer school so far, but I'm going to try and define it. So the main goal is you want to try to combine the power of in-weights learning through gradient descent with the power of in-context adaptation through retrieval augmentation. In other words, just in time finding input examples. So if we take this example on the right-hand side, this is a question answering system. And the simplest way to use this would just be to ask a question directly. Where was Alan Turing born? And the model, in this case, also has access to a data store of either facts or knowledge, whatever you want to describe by knowledge, or documents. And the model is trying to combine features from the retrieved facts in the data store with the given input question for the task. And the goal is that this will hopefully improve the quality of the model's output. This image is taken from Isaac and Grav in 2021. And so the motivation for this line of work is, well, we can clearly observe that vision and language models are getting bigger and being trained on huge amounts of data, as I just described before the break. And there's an alternative approach which is emerging that is reusing these independent backbones and trying to train small, lightweight mapping layers between pre-trained image encoders and language decoders. And so what we've been interested in is, if we use retrieval augmentation in this setup, can we improve model performance? And there's got to be a pretty open question of how do you do retrieval augmentation here, because you don't have any obvious data you can retrieve. And the model that we built for this is called Paella. So I'm going to motivate the model using an example. So here is Paella as an input to the model. And at its core, it has an image encoder and a learned mapping network and a frozen language model. And given the image of the paella, we have a frozen retrieval system. And this retrieval system is going to grab sentences that could describe this image. There's no guarantee that they will. And they're also language specific. So if we're trying to do image description in Spanish, we'll grab some sentences in Spanish or in Italian or English and so on. And then for a given language, we will take the top K retrieved sentences and put this into a prompting template where I'm showing the one here in English. Similar images show is the start of our prompting template. And then we have the sequence of the retrieved captions from the data store. So a big metal pan with, I don't know, food inside it. And then at the end of this section of retrieved captions, we have an instruction to the model. A caption I can generate to describe this image in English is this. And then you could imagine for Italian or Spanish or Mandarin Chinese, the template looks differently and the instruction looks different. And this is the input to the frozen language model, which then will, through supervised fine-tuning, produce a sentence that describes that image in this language, trying to take some of the benefits of retrieval augmentation along the way. So there's a lot of details going on here. The first is the retrieval system. How do you build this? We use FICE as a data store. And in FICE, we store high-dimensional vectors. In particular, it's the embedded representations of captions. And the captions are produced using CLIP. We use a multilingual CLIP model. And for each sentence that we would like to be able to retrieve, it's stored in FICE. And then when we have a given input image, we compare its embedding representation to the representations in the data store and order them by cosine similarity and retrieve the top K nearest neighbors while avoiding retrieving the caption that would actually describe the image because it's the matched pair. And so this is kind of a visualization. So this is like the example we saw just before the break, where you have this, I think it was in the Flamingo model. So on the right-hand side here, we have the standard transformer decoder. The model that we're using is XGLM. It doesn't have cross-attention layers inside of it, so we insert them and we randomly initialize them. And these attend to the image patch output embeddings on the left-hand side. So this is our vision transformer. It splits the image into patches. It encodes all of the data. We get one patch embedding per patch. And this is what the model attends over. And in some earlier work, we also demonstrated the power of lower rank projection matrices in our cross-attention. So I think our model has maybe 24 or 32 layers in the transformer encoder. So if we want to add full rank cross-attention matrices, then we have 500 million trainable parameters, which is pretty large. Instead, what we found out through experimentation is that you can have a lower rank projection where you go down to as low as 8 dimensions in the cross-attention projection space, thus training only 34 million parameters. And the performance is just as good as using the full rank 128 dimension projection matrix. There's also some other papers we have which shows the gains or the losses as you vary the rank of this. And in terms of our experimental protocol, so it's the multilingual CLIP encoder, which encodes the images and the sentences for the data store and also processes the visual data on the model. We use XGLM 2.9 billion as the variant. And our training data, we wanted to be quite bold here. We train on 560,000 captions sampled uniformly across a machine translated version of the COCO dataset, which I covered at the start of this morning's discussion. And we evaluate on an out-of-distribution dataset called XM3600, which is 3,600 geographically diverse images where there are covering 36 different languages, 100 images per language, all written by native speakers of those languages. So our training distribution is not the same as our evaluation distribution, but the uniform sample is targeted to cover these 36 languages. So how does the model perform? We're quite happy. So in the I've ordered these by the number of learned parameters, which is the third column. So we have Pali at the top, which has 17 billion learned parameters and is trained on 12 billion image sentence pairs. And it gets the best performance across all 36 languages. And if I had the compute power to train this kind of model, I think we could also do quite well. But then if we kind of step down the scale here, we can see 2.6 billion parameters trained on 19 million data points. The performance of this model is really bad. This was a model used to present the XM3600 dataset. And then on the third row here, we have the MBLIP model, which I mentioned earlier this morning. This model is trained on 130 million data points, and it's much better than training on just 19 million data points. And we come all the way down the bottom here to Paella, our model, which is trained on 500,000 data points with 30 million parameters that need to be estimated. And it's performing competitively against everything except for Pali. Even though it has such a small amount of data used to train it. These multipliers are just enormous. And we can also do some really exciting things like push the boundary of zero-shot transfer. So instead of training on a uniform distribution across all of these different languages, we can just train it on English data and imagine that the multilingual language model is going to take us the rest of the way. And we can see here, so this number 15.5, it's much lower than 26.2. So there's clearly a benefit to being trained multilingually. But this model now performs competitively with a model trained on 35 different translated versions of Coco. So there's clearly a lot happening with multilingual language models, and we can take advantage of this. In the paper, there is also some more details on what happens if you train on different languages as your monolingual language. It turns out Danish is the worst language to train on, which causes me a lot of anxiety as somebody in Denmark. So Danish really breaks every other language we evaluate on. Like, the performance you can get in domain in Danish is massive. It's like 100 CIDR points, and it makes an English performing model get like 2 points, which basically means it produces nothing. Or whereas if you train on something like Spanish or Mandarin and Chinese, it doesn't break everything else. And so there's a special place for research in the future on why is Danish such a great language. We can also investigate the value of the retrieval augmentation component. So this is a plot here of the core languages in XM3600. We didn't choose them, the dataset authors chose them. And for English, Spanish, Hindi, and Chinese, the red column is where we have used our model, but it doesn't have retrieval augmentation. And then if we take a variant where the model is image blind, in other words, it's not allowed to cross-attend into the image, it's only allowed to use the retrieved captions, the performance of the model improves, and that's shown there in the gray bar. But the cool thing about this is that it's like, okay, your model's not just a cross-lingual paraphrasing model, because when we give it access to the image in the green bar in Paella, we can see that the improvement is consistent across these 4 core languages. And I think it's like a super nice demonstration of what you can gain by retrieval augmentation in a low compute, low resource setup. I think we trained this model on 1 GPU in 8 hours. So this is the type of research you can do without infuriating the other people in your research groups. And we can also take a look at some qualitative examples here. So this is a cherry-picked example of an owl, and we can see that the retrieval system does a really good job retrieving captions that describe this image, even though this image doesn't appear in our training data set. Sorry, our value, yeah, exactly. And we can see here that it does a good job. And then if we compare paella at the top, in English, it produces an owl sitting on top of a tree. Whereas the no-rag version says a large black and white picture of a bird, which is just rubbish. And if we look through the other examples in Spanish and Hindi and Mandarin Chinese, for those of you who speak these languages, please tell me that these glosses are correct. I hope that they are. But in all of these languages, the model produces a good description of the actual object in the image. Whereas we can see, for example, in the no-rag version on Mandarin Chinese, it says it's a giraffe sitting on a branch, which is just not possible. I have never seen something like this. It would be pretty terrifying. Whereas in Spanish and Hindi, it understands that it's a bird, an animal of flight, but it's not getting the details quite accurately. And I think this is just a nice demonstration of the power of retrieval augmentation. And I'm going to go even further. So Rita created a demo in Hugging Face space. And I have a couple of images. So let's take a look here. What's this? Okay, so this is an image I took 2 days ago at the Gulbenkian Museum, which is pretty close. If you haven't been yet, it's awesome. So we can submit this and hopefully it will be okay. A tall wooden building, no, sitting in the middle of a forest. So it's half right, half wrong. A tower is standing in the middle of the trees and jungle. A clock tower juts into the air amongst the trees. It's desperately trying hard to do retrieval on this. An elaborate treehouse, maybe. So it's not quite there, but it's getting somewhere. We can also, I don't know, what's this? I went to a concert at a jazz festival. This was a really good band. I enjoyed it a lot. And it's a pretty decent description. The retrieved examples, well, it's not for musicians. I don't know why it's a mirrored image. I don't understand that. But it is indeed a windowless room. It's a squat in the north of Copenhagen. So that does pretty well. What's here? So this is last night. We went out for dinner and I was amazed by the amount of goat's cheese just sitting on the table. I was super excited and I took a photograph and the model, it's not perfectly accurate. I mean, it does kind of, I don't know what reed cheese is, but that's the crowdsourced description that somebody wrote. There are indeed bread and cheese and wine, but the model doesn't produce the cheese output at the end. But it's pretty fast and it's pretty accurate. So not all of my examples are cherry-picked. And let's just go a bit further. If you have a phone, oh, everyone has a phone. So you can try this for yourself in English. If you take an image of the QR code, the server, the Hugging Face space doesn't save your images. So everything should be kind of fine. And while you're doing that, I guess I got one more example maybe. So I went to a museum in Mexico. Okay, so I'm in a bit of a queue now. I'm in an even bigger queue. Okay. I mean, it's running on a GPU, so this is as fast as it's going to get. So maybe for those of you that got at the front of the queue, Do you want to share some kind of reflection on whether it actually produced a sentence that described your image? Was it even remotely accurate? Was it embarrassingly bad? Oh, well, that's just a terrible output. This is kind of like the problem of repetitive outputs in language models that we should have fixed a long time ago. I don't know why the person's wearing a yellow tie. And it's true, I was looking at a statue on display. Does anyone have any reflections they'd like to share on how bad this is for them? Yeah, I think the queue is probably fully loaded. You have one? You uploaded a picture of this. Okay.
It says a man standing in front of large screen, and a man gives a presentation next to a large presentation screen, and the speaker reading from his notes while presenting.
Yep.
A man standing up giving a presentation. A man standing in front of a large whiteboard giving a talk. So
It seems quite accurate. Although I don't know how it knows I'm reading from my notes, but that's neural networks.
Here,
Here?
I give it a photo of a bunch of magnetic toys,
Okay.
kind of constructed like a tower. It says a bunch of colorful cakes sitting on top of each other.
A bunch of colorful kids.
Cakes.
Okay, cakes. That's better.
Yeah, I sent the picture we were taking at the door,
Okay.
and it says a group of people standing in front of a building. And then also a group of people standing next to each other in front of a building. Or the last one is a room full of people working at laptop computers. I can't see any laptop there. I can ensure, but might be the windows are misleading the.
Did anyone have their laptop for the group photo?
No. But
No?
might be the windows. The windows in the.
You had a laptop? But in your bag, not in, yeah. So hopefully we'll have the multilingual version of this online later this week, and you can try it again later to see how bad it is when it works outside of the English language. Because while I show all these CIDR scores, the reality of it is quite different. And that's why I wanted to do this demo. I'm not trying to hide anything from you, and I want you to experience it yourself. I'm not even going to try and put anything else in this queue. I assume it's probably at 50 or something, and it's at 25? That's not bad. Okay. Okay. So we tried it. And we've also done some other work in this area on trying to do multilingual image captioning without looking at images at all, just prompting language models. We've also done English-only variants of this, which is the one you're using now. And I think that you can do a lot of interesting work with retrieval augmentation just because you offload some of the responsibilities for learning from in weights to in context through adaptation. And that's the main message I'd like to convey, and I hope you take this with you as part of a takeaway message from the talk. The second piece of work I'd like to describe here is also appeared at NACL in Mexico on sequential compositional generalization. And I've been interested in compositionality for a long time. And I think that given recent advances in vision and language models, we need to start working on tasks that require more sophisticated logical or common sense reasoning. There are two examples that you can see out in the literature. One is recipe-based question answering, or there's also science-based question answering using information from textbooks. And what I'm going to talk about now is a task that requires models to reason across sequences of multimodal inputs. Our data is sourced from Epic Kitchens 100, and there's an example of what this looks like over here. So these are head-mounted recordings from 45 different kitchens around the world. And there are really rich annotations of the objects that appear in these head-mounted recordings, and also human-authored action descriptions. which cover 93 different types of verbs and 300 types of objects. And so what I was trying to show here in the example just is the variety, the visual variety of the data and the complexity of what's happening in it. And so, oh dear. Nope. This is not going to work. Come on. Next. Wait, now we're just breaking everything. Okay. So from this really huge resource of egocentric visual data, we create something called the compact data set, where we have multimodal sequences that are aligned through time. So we have audio recordings, but it's not speech. People are not talking in these videos. We also have video frames, which can be either the full segment video frame or you can subsample frames from it. And also these short human author descriptions like clean bowl, open dishwasher, open drawer. The next step in the sequence is something like put bowl in dishwasher. And this is the type of knowledge we want to really target in these multimodal models. So we focus on two different types of tasks. One of them is next description prediction as a language generation problem. In other words, producing the final utterance, the verb-noun combination, after observing everything up to that point. Or just to disentangle what's happening in the language generation from a classification problem, just the prediction of which verb is going to be the next active verb or which object is going to be used as the next active object within the sequence. And so we take this data set and we split it using maximum compound divergence, which is going to give us a data set that requires compositional generalization. So we take the nouns and verbs from these simple descriptions and we use these as our atoms. And with MCD, we create data sets where on the left-hand side here, I'm showing the atoms themselves. They have a similar distribution over training, validation, and test. Whereas the compounds of them, in other words, the noun-verb pairs, are completely different in the validation and test data. So there's a lot of data that's not observed in training. And I think this is a great way to evaluate our models. We need to be evaluating things out of distribution, even though the in-distribution data looks atomically identical. And we have nearly 9,000 of these multimodal sequences. This is just an example of how you can maybe think about the data. So we have the frequency of a particular verb. And along the x-axis here, we have all the different verbs. This is like the 93 verbs, which are also broken down into categories. So on the right-hand side, I'm highlighting there's a category for sense. And this is associated with the verbs to pat or to eat or to feel or to smell. Or there's different verbs that can describe the act of splitting, so cutting and peeling and breaking and ripping. And so this is the data that we have, and we evaluate a lot of different models on this. We have a collection of baseline models that we train by ourselves on the compact data set that are either a text-only model or different combinations of the multimodal inputs. So maybe vision and language or audio and language or vision and audio and language. And maybe you already have some thoughts about which one you think will be the best. You're probably wrong. The pre-trained models we use are in an 8-shot prompting setup. So we use a text-only based model. We use Llama 2 chat. We also use Idifix, which is a multimodal model pre-trained by some people in Hugging Face. We have Open Flamingo, which is an attempt to recreate the DeepMind Flamingo architecture, and Otter, which is a video processing model. And on the right-hand side, there's no guarantee that these models have to compositionally generalize because they've been pre-trained on so much data, whereas our baselines are in a different situation. And our baseline architecture is pretty straightforward. So we have modality-specific encoding of the data. It could be that we have VGG sound to process the speech audio data. It's not speech. We have a transformer encoder to process the textual inputs, and then we also have a ResNet 50 and a faster RCNN to get objects and visual features from the image. And then we have a cross-modal attention block where the visual features attend into the language features, or if you're doing audio processing, you might do audio to language cross-attention in exactly the same way, giving you a set of multimodal representations, which are the input to a randomly initialized transformer decoder, which is going to be trained to predict these distributions over the noun-verb compositions. In terms of prompting, we tried to use some of the expected behaviors within the literature of how to prompt models like Llama 2. So this is an example where we're showing it 3 examples for context. We have an instruction, we have the input-output pairs, and we use this to prompt the model. And for idefix, we're doing this kind of interleaved processing where the model gets a single frame, which we pick from the image, from the video data. We took the central frame, and then we interleave it with text, image, and then it has to produce this output. The baseline models, we take multi-part tokens like olive oil, and we combine these into a single token just to prevent sparse statistics in our data set here. The pre-trained multimodal models are all using their own tokenizers. The data is just given it as the model wants to process it. And all of these experiments used a single GPU with 16 gigabytes of RAM, and our baselines took less than an hour to train. So you can do this research by yourself. It's not hugely labor intensive. And all of our prompting models were also using 16 gigabyte GPUs. So that's why our limit is 8. In terms of our evaluation, we use Blur score because nobody can get away from Blur score when you do text generation, even though we know it's terrible. Sorry, it's as good as we can do. No. We also, for the classification tasks, we look at exact match. So does the model really predict exactly the verb that we expected? And because we have categorical information, we also have a backoff where if the model predicts a verb within the category, then we'll give it some partial credit, because maybe slicing and chopping is reasonably similar, but I'm not a linguist, so I can't argue about this for hours. In terms of the performance of models, when we look at the next utterance prediction problem, which is producing these small sentences, if we start with the blue models, everything is clearly much better than doing language-only processing, but there's not such a clear winner from using different combinations of input modalities. So vision and language performs only slightly better than using the audio features and the language, which really surprised me. And when you combine all of these together in audio, video, and language, it's really not much better than seeing either of these modalities independently. What we do find is that if instead of using something like VGG Sound and ResNet, we use maybe the image bind encoder from Meta, this does give improvements when we're encoding the audio and the visual data using that. So there's a clear win to be found from this. Whereas when we look at the few-shot prompting of the multimodal models, they fall really short in terms of the performance here, even though they don't have to do the same type of composition or generalization. The text-only model performs the best in this case, and some of the other models like idefix and Open Flamingo and Otter, they really do not succeed in producing these output sequences. You can also ask, but your prompting's wrong. So we looked into this, and there is a clear benefit from increasing the number of shots in our few-shot prompts. And it's almost consistent across the models. Otter just never really manages to pick up the task we're asking it to solve. But for Llama 2 and then the idefix multimodal model, there is a nice trend. And perhaps with idefix, if we had more GPU RAM, we could have pushed this performance even further. But then we'd have the same thing for Llama, where now we've got more data we can fit on there. You might also think, MCD splits are a waste of time. You didn't have to do that. But the random IID data is much easier for models to generalize to across the spectrum. So I think this is a really nice example of the importance of thinking about how you format your data and how you're going to be evaluating. And then if we step away from the language generation task and we look at, for example, noun prediction, we had this really surprising outcome, which is that the most naive approach you could adopt to this is just to take the label of the noun that appeared in the previous segment and say that's the answer. And no neural network model actually recovers this naive heuristic. Every single model from left to right is only just above chance performance when we look at categorical accuracy. Whereas if you just predict the label of the noun you saw in the previous segment, you'd already be above chance. So I think that there's still a huge amount of work to do in this direction in terms of how these models can actually process these types of multimodal sequences and multi-image sequence data sets in general. We have some qualitative examples here. We've seen this one already. The answer is definitely something about putting the bowl in the dishwasher. Most of the models want to close the dishwasher, which is a bad continuation. And here's another example sequence where you're putting the pan in the drainer, you're picking up the mug and you're picking up the sponge, and it's something to do with cleaning the mug or sponging the mug. It's definitely not putting the sponge in the sink like Llama 2 wants to predict. And so we're really seeing some of the problems here of not being able to attend to the visual data. And so I think that there's a huge amount of follow-up work we can do in this about how to integrate features into our model, maybe looking into exploring how we could fine-tune these language models and the multimodal ones using LoRa, because we do have some training data in here. And also moving forward into the future, how many more keyframes could we extract to get better representations of our visual inputs? I think this is also an open question that we need to study, especially when you think about models like GPT-4 and Gemini, where they claim they can process 1 million input context examples. We could probably fit most of these videos into it, but would it perform better? I guess I should give someone some GPU credits and they can find out. So in this fourth section, we've wrapped up our modeling section. We're going to briefly cover some work on understanding multimodal models. So I think that the field is trying to move beyond benchmarking. I know that sounds crazy because every week you have Lava Bench or Gemini Bench or whatever bench. It comes out every week, but these are like input-output example demonstrators. I don't think we're getting towards a deeper understanding of how our models work here. And I think that we should be asking deeper questions. For example, what is driving the success of a model? Is it because they can make better use of multimodal data? Is it that maybe they've acquired skills during pre-training? Have they learned how to count? Have they learned how to localize something into a specific region of the image? Or maybe we're interested in thinking about linguistics-based questions, like is there a particular construct that the model is capable of handling more better? We've also going to see some work on model internal behavior and analyzing this, and also probing models to see how they work on different types of skills. The main and dominant approach to doing this type of understanding research is based on foils. And so typically with a foil, you'll have an image sentence pair in which something in this pair is just wrong. And you demonstrate model understanding by showing that it doesn't understand this. And so in this case here on the left-hand side, the sentence reads, people riding bicycles down the road approaching a dog, and it's a bird. And so the model should recognize this and say it's not correct. In addition to this, we'd also like the models to be able to localize where in the image the wrong object is. Is it that the people are not cycling? Is it that they're not people? No, it's that it's a bird. And also, could you correct this mistake? Can you demonstrate understanding through correction? These are typically crowdsourced data sets, although there are some approaches to manually producing these. And in 2020, there was something called the value benchmark, which was a suite of 5 different probing tasks looking at modality importance or linguistic knowledge within the model, or probing the degree of multimodal fusion, probing whether the model understands visual co-reference across modalities or whether it understands visual relations. And one of the analyses I'd like to highlight here is at the time, the authors tried to estimate what's the layer-wise contribution to this unifying or pooled CLS embedding by looking at the representation fused from all the different language inputs or the visual inputs. And what they found at the time was that this model called Uniter relied a lot more on textual features when it was fusing modalities throughout the model. Even though it had access to all of this visual data, the model was initialized from a BERT-style architecture, and it really retained a lot of these linguistic processing properties. The VALS benchmark is a really nice example of a data set to test visual linguistic capabilities. It's framed as a sentence image matching task, where it covers many different types of behaviors you expect a model to learn, like existential quantification or counting or co-reference or action replacements. And the foils are created so in the top right, a small copper vase with some flowers in it, or a small copper vase with exactly one flower in it. This is kind of probing these really fine-grained understanding properties. And what was found at the time was that, I mean, you'd have to redo this now in 2024, but not many of the models performed better than text-only baselines, which is kind of a concerning approach when you think about that. There's also been a line of work on trying to create vision and language checklists where you want to evaluate models based on performing automatic augmentations to the data. Once again, framed as an image sentence matching task, there are so many common themes in this area of understanding models. And you can also use this to visualize which aspects or which properties of these manipulations are the models robust to. Some work was also proposed on creating subject-verb-object probes, where there was a really large-scale data set mined from conceptual captions and formulated as foil detection, where they would also have positive and negative pairs, where you want the model to be able to demonstrate it understands the difference between a hedgehog and a woman. In the bottom example, that it really knows the difference between these semantic categories. Maybe some of you are familiar with the Winnow Crown dataset of 1,600 image text pairs to evaluate this more rich compositional understanding, where the sentences are rewritten in a way such that if the model really understands what it means to be a light bulb surrounding plants, then it will understand what representation is shown in there. And this is a nice example of images which were sourced from a distributor, Getty, with permission for redistribution. I'm not sure how easy it would be for us to get this, but if you work at Meta, maybe it's slightly easier to get that kind of permission. And you can also ask whether these models are vision for language or language for vision models by ablating out different parts of the input based on the objects in question, or maybe some of the textual labels in question. And you can find here that the models, at least at the time in 2021, were much more sensitive to losing some of the visual data rather than losing some of the language data, which I think was a really interesting observation from that time. And so this very quick overview of this understanding field, which is evolving at a rapid pace, is that foil detection remains the most popular methodology in the area. I'm not sure how long this will last, but I think that we are witnessing a shift here with people moving towards more linguistically informed analyses. I think this will be an exciting area in the future for people with a linguistics background. Maybe some of you in the room identify with that. And I think there's some great work that you can do in the future. And also this careful handcrafting of data sets and looking towards simple metrics to measure performance. We're reaching the end, but we're not quite there. So I want to speculate wildly about some directions that I think will be important research in the future. So I'm really excited by, are you going to play? Come on. So I think that trying to predict and explain physical actions in the world is just going to be of super high importance when we're going to create embodied agents. And I think we can learn a lot by working in more synthetic or toy scenarios. So this is a scenario with some cute shapes, and the models are tasked with questions like how many objects are prevented by the tiny green triangle from falling into the basket. And this is the type of task where, given this initial image state, as a human being, you can perform a simulation in your head about the interactions you think might occur. And maybe I shouldn't have shown you the video. Maybe we should have done a poll. But unfortunately, I've ruined this opportunity. But I think it's like super cool because you're like, yeah, that's stupid. Yeah. And of course, they've got googly eyes, so it's obviously an instant winner. But there are so many videos that have been synthetically created with this in mind. And I think that this type of physical interaction understanding, I think this is exciting. I like this a lot. I'm also quite excited about text-based video games. So there's a video game called NetHack. Hands up if you've played NetHack. Oh, two people. NetHack is a dungeon crawling video game where you move around a procedurally generated world and you're desperately trying to reach the end of the game, but it's hard to get there. And it's super hard to get there if you're a neural net. Because this is the world that you see. And the annotations here, like hidden passage and closed doors, you don't see that as a player of this game. Instead, you have to learn how to act in this space. And this is a reinforcement learning problem that I think really comes to the heart of language representation learning, but also acting. And instead of trying to do this in 3D worlds, we can just try to do this, first of all, in these simpler 2D worlds. And I think this is really nice and great fun. More recently, ECCV 24 this year, there's a new data set for learning interactions on either desktops or in web browsers. This is called OmniAct, where the model needs to do really complex multimodal understanding and program execution to assist people in performing regular kind of daily tasks with their computers, like find the weather in Chicago on the 18th of September. And the evaluation of this is that the model will write the expected program and localize this region in an image. I think that this is a nice example of a kind of future-looking multimodal task. And I would love a world in which we can write these programs and write these ourselves instead of having companies mine our desktops every few seconds for collecting data. This is something I would like to be able to do, but I want to do it on my terms, using models that run locally on my own machine. Maybe you feel similarly. I also think that multilinguality is just going to be an increasingly important direction to think about in the future, because most of the work is still in English, and we need resources and models and evaluations that go well beyond English. But this requires time, money, and engagement, three things which are in limited scope, especially if you're starting your PhD or you're in the middle of it. And also, I think, thinking about biases and fairness and what types of intrinsic biases are learned in multimodal learning. How do they affect downstream performance? As we see models being deployed into the wild, this aspect of fairness and safety is only going to become more important. In terms of some insights into what we're trying to do right now in Copenhagen, we're trying to work with really fine-grained multimodal data. Wenyan Li created a data set with domain-specific VQA data in the domain of Chinese food, where she created a highly detailed taxonomy of many different aspects of Chinese food. And from this, collected private data from people, from their mobile phones. We paid for the data. And so we have these images that have not been seen before for multimodal learning. There are human questions associated with each of the images, and there are three different types of problems that you can work on here. So there's multi-image VQA. All the data is written in Mandarin Chinese, but it's like, which of these is a cold dish in Sichuan cuisine? This task is super hard, especially if you don't know anything about Chinese food culture. If you do know something, then you'll know that it's example C. We also have single image VQA, where you just get this image here, maybe on the right-hand side, and from which region is this food a speciality? So this is a multimodal understanding problem where you really want to probe the difficulty. Or there's just text-based VQA. So what is the flavor of this particular sequence of Chinese characters? And if we look on the right-hand side, this is the evaluation of multi-image VQA performance. On the left-hand side, the lower bars, these are the publicly available open weights models. So Phi3, Idifix2, Mantis, and QuanVL. They perform really poorly in terms of English and Chinese examples. And this is quite surprising given that Quan is a bilingual English-Chinese model. We can see that GPT-4o performs a lot better than any of these models. So there's a huge scope for open weights models to improve in this type of task. And we can improve them in a way where we know the provenance of the data and we can estimate what was actually useful there. Because we can see even for a model like GPT-4o in Chinese, it does not perform as well as the human experts in this case. And the naive English annotator who processed 100 examples at random is almost as good at GPT-4o at this. And I assure you, this English annotator knows nothing about Chinese food culture at all. But, you know, this person knows just about as much as a model trained on an enormous amount of internet textual multimodal data. Another thing is working towards community-driven multimodal data. So there's a huge effort on trying to collect data sets or to scrape them from the web. And the thing about trying to pay people for data is that most budgets just don't scale, because you end up having to pay crowd workers huge amounts of money in order to do this. And we're inspired by a project called Visipedia, where this is a collected effort to collect images of the natural world. And it's a collaboration between people who want to take photographs and then domain experts and also annotators on the web and researchers and scientists coming together. And we want to try to do the same thing in collecting multilingual and multimodal data. And so far, we have people from a large number of different countries on board. But we're always looking for more people. And if you want to get involved in this, please reach out to me. I'm especially keen to speak to people from South America or any part of Africa, because we're so poorly represented in terms of our data collection approach there. And we're also trying to view this as a gamified data collection problem where, in addition to collecting images and data from people, we also want to show them what is the state of the art in terms of the models at the time and to collect their feedback. For those of you who read Danish, the computer-generated sentence here is complete garbage. It just says a man with a pig, which, you know, it's kind of on the right direction, but it's really bad, because this is a particular type of meat within Danish food culture. And I'm going to wrap up here by finishing on a piece of future work that we're trying to pursue. It's the final kind of researchy part of this lecture, which is based on the question of what would happen if we just treated language as vision. And this is a line of work we've been pursuing for maybe 2 years now. The final part of this talk is going to have some dataset samples that contain racist text, because we're working with a dataset of historical newspapers. They're going to be in orange. So if you don't want to look at them, you don't have to, and I'm not going to describe them out loud. Yesterday, Sarah showed basically the same slide as this. We are in the era of scale in NLP, where the more compute and the more data you throw at the models and the more engineering and architectural developments you have, the better the models perform. Sarah even showed this image from Wei and colleagues in 2022 of how some tasks become possible to solve just by scaling the amount of data and the parameters in it. And one thing I'm really passionate about is, instead of thinking about scale, is to think about NLP for all written languages. And there are 3,000 written languages in the world, of which 400 have at least 1 million speakers. And NLP has typically been covering about 100 to 150 languages, which results in technological exclusion for billions of people, as shown in this image here by Yoshi and colleagues. And I think that we need to be able to create systems that people can use by themselves and develop within their own local contexts for languages that are not just high resource. And that's the question that we're trying to ask and answer here. And so in order to try to answer this question, we have to reflect on the fact that NLP is a pipeline where we start with raw text and then we normalize it, and then we split our text into subword tokens, and we have a terrible subword tokenizer here for Danish, which splits Kikugo into 3 meaningless subwords. And then each of these subwords gets associated with a vector, as we learned from Noah and Danke's talk. And then we use this to do some kind of syntactic or semantic analysis with GPT or Llama, or maybe do some kind of prompting. But this pipeline is so easily broken because now I've added in one new token, CERN. This token is not found. The embedding of this is not meaningful unless you have a byte level backoff. And this issue disproportionately affects lower resource languages, for example, Amharic, where it's unlikely that you'll be able to process this. Or you do it at byte level and your sequences are enormous in length. And Noah also mentioned a line of work at University of Washington on exploring like which languages are actually well represented in these models. So we identify that the vocabulary in a language model is the key bottleneck that we need to overcome to create NLP technologies for all languages. Because NLP is an open vocabulary problem and new words appear all the time, and our models need to handle them. For example, processing social media data or using medical data with lots of abbreviations. And the vocabulary creates 2 bottlenecks. One of them is representational bottleneck in the embedding layer, and the other is a computational bottleneck in the output layer. And you can ask, where's the sweet spot? And it's nowhere. So you can pay the cost of having really large vocabulary coverage by using bytes to represent your inputs. You have a model like byte T5 and you have really long sequence lengths. And then you develop algorithmic and architectural approaches to kind of compressing down these sequence lengths. On the other end of the spectrum, you have huge vocabularies. I think the largest vocabulary I know is Word2Vec, which is one of the first neural language models that was widespread in its use. It had 3 million entries. Nobody does this anymore. It's so huge. And so the main idea we were trying to pursue is to treat language as visual processing. So we're going to throw everything away. Not do any of this pre-processing, and instead to treat text as visual data. And what this means is that our Amharic sentence, like you see here, we can render this into an image and we can process this just as if it's any other language that we can render using fonts in an orthographic format. And we call this approach pixel. So the way that this works is that we have a collection of data on disk. For example, my cat, weird sequence of symbols, enjoys eating warm oatmeal for lunch and dinner. We use open source font libraries, for example, Google Noto and then Pango Cairo, to render this text into an image. And you can see these are patches. So you're thinking already it's a vision transformer. From there, we project these patches using a convolution layer with a position embedding information. And then we do span masking across random subsequences of patches because we want to be able to process any language, so we can't rely on white space separation anymore. The observed patches are processed by a transformer encoder, and then a transformer decoder tries to reconstruct the unobserved, in other words, masked patches at the pixel level using a mean squared error loss. So no part of the input knows anything about what it means to be words or grammar or structure, and no part of the output does either. I'm yet to be convinced that mean squared error reconstruction induces grammatical structure. The first criticism you could level is that the rendered text is going to be huge. But pixel encoding produces sequence lengths that are similar in length to BERT-style models. So here I'm showing you an example. This is from the Universal Dependencies dataset. The reference segmentations come from humans. And this is for Turkish. On the x-axis, we have the number of tokens or patches. Yellow is the reference, so none of the segmentation approaches or tokenizers are close to that. But Pixel in the pink dotted line is competitive with BERT and MBERT. And if we look across other languages here, it's a very similar story. And in some cases, pixel patch-based encoding produces much shorter sequences. So for example, with Arabic or with Japanese, we can produce really short sequence lengths that can actually squeeze more information than the reference segmentation, because for things like diacritic encoding, we can just draw it straight in. So we're not paying a length penalty in terms of how we process the data. There's one small caveat here, which is that for Korean, the reference BERT segmenter produces unknown tokens for every single token. And so it trivially recovers the reference segmentation length, but not really understanding what's there. So we take this idea of the model and we pre-train it using only English data. So this is the Wikipedia and Books corpus. And we trained it for 8 days on 8 A100 GPUs. But now we have this down to about 18 hours on A100 GPUs. And our model is super compact. It's less than just over 100 million parameters in total. And there's only a trace amount of non-English text within our pre-training data. And one of the things you get out of this straight away during pre-training is a new type of generative model in the pixel space. So these are examples of reconstructions at different stages of pre-training. A document that one of the students, Philip, found about penguins and their knees. So it's unlikely it's seen this. But in blue here, I'm trying to highlight the model during pre-training gets much better at reconstructing at the pixel level what's missing. For example, in the bottom example, at 500,000 steps, the model hallucinates an English word that doesn't exist. There is no such thing as occlusion, to the best of my knowledge. But by the end of pre-training at 1 million steps, it does indeed correctly predict that this is an illusion. And there are some sequences that the model just never gets any success in reconstructing. It keeps on producing really mixed outputs, trying to render multiple words at the same time. And if you want, you can also try this for yourself. You can put it in any web page. This model that's on Hugging Face Spaces is only pre-trained in English. We do have some multilingual variants, but we've not yet released them anywhere. And the slides are available online. So you can just copy and paste a newspaper article from today, and it will try its best to reconstruct this. You'll be able to see these examples by yourself. We evaluate this approach to language representation learning using 4 types of downstream tasks. We were looking at syntactic processing, sentence level processing, named entity recognition, and also the ability of the models to process really perturbed textual inputs. We compare this model against BERT, also Canine, and I know that there are many other models. I also attended the other lectures. But BERT has almost an identical pre-training setup. And Canine is trying to solve the same problem that we're trying to address here, but using UTF-32 code points. So if we look at the dependency parsing performance after pre-training and then fine-tuning, they're showing F1 score here on the y-axis, and along the x-axis, we have the different languages. And I'm also showing the unknown token rate for different languages. So for Coptic, you cannot do dependency parsing at all if you use tokenization-based models based on BERT. But if you use Pixel, now you can actually do syntactic analyses of Coptic text. And we see the same thing for Korean and Tamil and Mandarin Chinese, where you can do much better by processing visual representations of the data. In terms of named entity recognition, where we have sentences like this, we can see that on the non-Latin script Amharic, BERT doesn't do anything here. It cannot recognize any named entities. Whereas Canine which use UTF-32 code points, really can. It's getting close to 50. And our pixel-based approach, which is trained on much less data, outperforms Canine. And this is pretty much the same story across almost all of the different languages here. Trained on less data, trained with fewer parameters, but performing slightly better. And then after we finished working on this project, we realized we did it all wrong. So text rendering is crucially important when you're trying to learn from visual representations. And our original text renderer was dreadful. These are the top 10 occurring patches in our pre-training data set, and there's something in common with all of them. They're just these like slight horizontal shifts. This is not worth learning. And so what we try to do here is to investigate different types of rendering strategies. The original approach is called continuous. Then we have a structured approach based on trying to render character bigrams into patches, or trying to use monospaced fonts, which has a drawback because not all languages can be written using monospaced fonts, especially if you need to, where each word must start in its own patch. And what we can see now is on the y-axis, we have the number of unique patches. On the x-axis, we have the number of sentences observed. Our original strategy was so terrible and wasteful. After observing 10,000 sentences, we had 250,000 unique patches. This is not the type of capacity we want to devote our model to learning. Whereas using something like the bigrams representation, it's down here, it's basically flat. So that's the one that we've been adopting more recently. And from this, if we look at something like sentence level tasks using glue fine-tuned processing, bigram rendering gives a much better model than our original continuous rendering structure. We're almost at the performance of BERT-based models, which brings with it the benefits of everything that we've learned from decades of research and standard natural language processing in the pipeline that I described earlier. And the other thing we can do is we can scale down, which not many people talk about. So these text rendering strategies help us to create really small models. So in the kind of grayish green here, we have the pixel-based model. This was our wasteful approach. Then in orange, we have the bigrams model. This is at the 86 million parameter scale. And then we can, this is not distillation. This is not some kind of compression of a pre-trained model into a smaller model. This is training from scratch. So a 22 million parameter model performs almost the same as an 86 million, and a 5 million parameter model, which you could run anywhere, performs worse, but it's still surprisingly resilient at this really small scale. And then if we think about this application, this is where I'm going to show some textual examples with racist text. We've been thinking about historical document processing. There's been a huge worldwide effort to digitize historical documents so that scholars can access information locked in libraries and other museums. And the typical pipeline for this is that you scan the documents into high quality, large digital formats. And then you perform OCR on those documents, maybe as a one-off process, and you hope that the OCR that comes out of it is useful. And then you allow people to search through these documents using the OCR annotations. And we wanted to ask, what could you do if you didn't need OCR? So we worked with some collaborators on a collection of Caribbean newspapers from 1718 to 1876. And these are humanities researchers who are particularly interested in tracking newspaper notifications about escaped slaves. They want to be able to calculate aggregated statistics over maybe the distribution of rewards offered in order for the return of an escaped slave, or the distribution of locations from where slaves were escaping. Is there some meta-analysis that we can perform here? And they have a huge data set of over 1 million pages, and nobody wants to do their PhD on looking through 1 million pages to manually find this information. So you can turn to machine learning techniques to try and automate this through a kind of what's called distant reading process. In order to do this, we had to adapt our model to do historical document-aware pre-training. And Nadav and Philip had this really neat trick where they pretended that Wikipedia was rendered like a historical newspaper. So we took this data from Wikipedia and the books corpus, and we changed font sizes and fonts families, and also the orientation of the image. Also like salt and pepper noise, simulating bad scanning environments. And we used this to pre-train a document that could hopefully process historical text. And then we framed this as a visual question answering problem. So we render the question we want asked into the image. For example, how much reward is offered? And then we render the newspaper clipping into the canvas. And for some of the data, we have information about where the answer can be found. And we train the model to predict this as a visual question answering problem. And when we compare this against a BERT-based model that works with gold standard orthographic transcriptions of the data, our model for historical document processing performs quite competitively, even though it has no orthographic representation at all. And it's also quite good at localizing where in the input you can find this information. In one of these examples, I show that the model's input attribution attention is focusing on a name, but it is not the expected name for the question of who's the contact person for this advertisement. And there's been other people who've worked on follow-up work in this direction. So Danke's group has been trying to combine patch prediction with token prediction, combining MSE reconstruction over patches with discrete predictions over tokens in a standard text decoder. I've read this paper, and I think it's a really nice extension of the work that is going on in this area. And some researchers from DeepMind also tried to do joint reasoning in a multimodal space directly, where instead of having a dual encoder model where you have an encoder for each different modality, here everything is processed visually through a shared model and a shared transformer representation. And they achieve this by rendering the questions directly into the image, like what's in the green phase, which is shown here at the top. And I think there are lots of really big open questions. For example, why or how does this work? So for people interested in interpretability, I think there are some big questions about whether this is exploiting orthographic similarity, or maybe it's actually learning grammatical representations. I don't yet see an answer to that. And also, we've been doing some work on trying to work multilingually in this case and scaling these models up. Because if somebody says a 13 billion parameter is a toy, then this is even not. But we're trying to think about how should we train this? Should we try to do this multilingually for 100 languages? Or should we do this based on visual script-based selection? And how much compute power do you want to dedicate to this to give local people around the world access to a low compute starting point for some of the projects they might want to work on, where instead of relying on API-based access to proprietary models, maybe this can be used to create local value within different ecosystems. This is the end. So today I have tried to give you, hopefully not too intense, an introduction to the idea of vision and language learning. I started with the assumption that maybe you didn't know anything about this field. And so I covered the ideas of data sets and tasks that are common within this area, representation of the data in terms of using maybe convolutional nets or visual transformers. I covered some of the key modeling approaches in terms of dual encoding or visual prefix learning, all the way up to the most recent multimodal large language models. We briefly covered some ideas in terms of understanding how these models work. And I also tried to wrap up with some speculation about exciting directions for the future. One of the things that, if you're thinking about moving into this area, is that there is no single place you can find scientific articles. If you look back through my slides, I try to include references, and the work appears in machine learning, natural language processing, and computer vision conferences. So if you want to do research in this area, you have to be prepared to read 3 times as much. as your colleagues. So keep that in mind. I'm happy to take some questions before we wrap up. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for this superb overview and challenging task. So if you go, one of the first slides was posing a very important question about how do we simulate and learn things, no? And I think the key idea was to what extent we can use multimodal inputs to, let's say, speed up learning in some of those modalities, probably language learning in terms of image-based interaction and so on. So by the end of the day, I cannot see how that question is answered in your proposal. So I think you're just proposing alternatives to cope with both modalities, even at most to correlate or coordinate, is a better word probably, both modalities, but know how to let one of them in working of the other. So maybe I've missed something, probably yes. So that was the first question. And the second one is about position embeddings. Because, I mean, language and image are two spaces which are not basically comparable. So the movement in language is along, let's say, one dimension. And movement in image is probably about one dimension which is hidden, except for the cases where you showed several images in sequence, like in the videos, headset mounted, and so on, which are very, very, very appealing, very challenging. So how those two worlds are going to be correlated? What's your view? Because you have a lot of experience. Thanks.
So I think your criticism of the work is completely valid. There is not much research in trying to connect any of this back to kind of cognitively plausible learning. I've seen some examples of this, but I didn't cover them today. So there is a paper that appeared in June at the North American Conference of Computational Linguistics, where the authors try to show that you can speed up the acquisition of language representations by grounding them into the visual world. But I haven't yet read this paper in sufficient detail to discuss it in my lecture today. So I didn't want to misrepresent it, because I think it's quite a strong claim, and I'm excited to see how this stands up. And I think you can maybe see that most of the tasks I've been talking about throughout today are not actually about language acquisition. Language acquisition is an entirely different field, and the complexities in studying this are enormous. I know of one particular study, I think from New York University, where the researchers had access to video recordings of a child growing up in a household. And this sounds like an incredible resource to learn from, but I can't imagine a world in which we would ever get access to this data publicly. So then we rely on maybe trying to use simulations where we could imagine models acquiring language over time. There's been some work by Felix Hill and others at DeepMind on trying to simulate this in 3D video game environments. But the language that's being acquired there is nowhere near as complex as human language that you might utter within the presence of a young child. You had a second question. What was your question?
Well, you can go into second language acquisition for the first. For the second would be related. How can you, let's say, correlate both kinds of representation? The one, I mean, the encoding part is quite different, and the position idea is quite different in an image and a language. So using the same, let's say, techniques, extracted from transformers, and then just mixing them. I don't see how it keeps, let's say, the order of things in a one-dimensional and a two-dimensional per last time recording.
So the positional information typically used to process visual data is two-dimensional. It's not a 1D encoding. It's usually also encoding information about the Y representation. So it's not just that it's input 17, it's that it's input 17 and it's technically on row 2. And there are many variations on how you can encode this type of visual data. But if you actually want to do full video processing, you would also use a model that encodes three-dimensional data through temporal representations. So you're encoding sequences of frames in the sequence. And it's difficult to see how this would happen at large scale with a multimodal model, especially if you're going to maybe serve this online through an API. There's a lot of engineering needs to happen in the back end. And I personally have no idea about how OpenAI and Gemini are doing this. We could speculate, but I'd rather not. Maybe one day they'll tell us, and then we can re-implement it ourselves. But I think you're right. It's a difficult problem. You cannot just naively apply the most straightforward approach. Thank you. Yes.
Hi, so I've been working a bit with the pixel models, and some impression I got is like they learn slower than maybe BERT and Tucker-based models, like they need more data and more compute. And I felt that is especially obvious when dealing with multilingual setups and especially with multi-script setups. So you mentioned you're training some multilingual models. Are they being trained on more data, and how many, if you can go into details, I would like to know the setup of the training.
Excellent detailed question. Yeah, so we tried the most naive thing, which was to pre-train on the multilingual Wikipedia dataset. Maybe you've also tried that, I don't know. We tried this at the same scale of the 86 million parameter base model. And you don't see an obvious improvement in downstream task performance. We also scaled it up to a larger vision transformer at 300 million parameters, and we still didn't see improvement from this kind of scale. So one of the things that we've done now is just to take a huge amount of extra data. Because if you look at some of the learnings that people have from vision processing in the VIT literature, the scale of the data they're using to train these models now is billions or tens of billions of patches. And so we've been trying to carefully collect data sets covering visually distinct language scripts, where I think at the moment we have maybe 300 billion tokens, which is a lot more than what you would get from something like Wikipedia in the books corpus. And we're also trying to investigate how we can scale this. And some of the results I showed here about training smaller models and still seeing improvements in performance. We're trying to do some investigations at smaller scales before scaling up. My hope is by the end of the year, we can have something maybe in the hundreds of million parameter version, because at the core, I'm still really passionate about distributing models that you can run in a collab session and it's not going to burn all of your compute credits. And maybe one day we'll get towards billions of parameters. But I'm not excited about billions of parameters. I'm excited about creating models that people can use in their local languages.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I thank you for the talk. I have a question about, it's here. So you were describing earlier, you were talking about models like vision language transformers, for instance, where you use where you basically mix kind of the modalities. And I was wondering if you have any intuitions or any experiments about how this would work with a pixel-based model where essentially both processing the text and the image would have some of the same. I guess you could use the same tools to process both. I wonder if that would improve maybe the transfer of information between the two modalities.
What do you mean by text and image?
So I mean the classic sense of processing some sentences, which in the pixel model you of course turn into image. But I'm just saying that, like, as in like a classic transformer language model, you would have the textual representation that you're processing plus the image representation when you're trying to do something wacky with the modalities. I wonder if you try to do the same thing with pixel, or if you have any intuitions on whether that would work better, for instance.
So if I understand you correctly, we could think of this as a hybrid model that either processes rendered patches or discrete tokens as the input.
I'm not quite sure if that's...
Well, then I'm very confused. So we are doing some research now where we're trying to interleave patches that are rendered text and discrete tokens. So like maybe you have a word that would be overly fragmented by a transformer, and it would produce 7 subwords. It might just produce 3 image patches. So we're exploring approaches to try to use tokens for high frequency representation and patches for lower frequency representation. But are you actually talking about photographs of the world, or are you talking about rendered text?
Yeah, photographs of the world. Yes. So I was talking something like in a paella-like model, for instance, if the language component was something like pixel.
Okay, we haven't tried this yet. I don't have a good intuition for how well it would work. But I guess that the Clippo model, which I tried to highlight at the end, is an approach to trying to use visual renderings of text and photos in the same model. And I think it's quite successful for them, especially when the tasks rely on OCR processing.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, so thank you for your talk. It was very interesting. I'd like to ask 2 things. First one is, if I understood correctly, with the pixel method, you're basically rendering text at the end because you're doing the masked model, let's say. Did you also try to generate full text? So like, I don't know, like a generative task, maybe using diffusions, or because that seems really interesting.
We've tried a couple of variants of this, but none of them have succeeded as much as we'd like. So we tried an autoregressive transformer decoder, where we wanted to patch by patch produce outputs. It really reverts to producing an average patch quite quickly. It has poor sequential modeling in that setup. It might be that if we used a diffusion-based model, it would be much better because we'd have all the denoising steps to do extra training over. I could see that as being a viable approach. And a question that I'm really struggling to come to terms with myself is, if you do this type of patch-based sequential generation, how are you going to get the text out of it at the end? You could do something like OCR using PyTesseract on top of it, but PyTesseract is only going to work well if the model is actually producing patches that look like good tokens. And at least at the scale I've been showing today, some of the predictions are a bit messy and noisy. You might not get useful information out of that. So at the moment, we're trying to target encoding-based tasks with a view in the future to working on decoding-based tasks once we can solve some of the fundamental problems. Because unlike some of the work using autoregressive language models, we don't have decades of collective knowledge underpinning our intuitions here. We have a couple of years of doing something wild that we're trying to scale up.
Okay, thank you. And
Thanks.
the second question, let me just check. Okay, so at some point you were talking about RAG with images. that was really interesting too. Have you tried maybe to convert the images into seeing graphs and use those graphs to condition the generation of the output? Or do you think this can be useful or not?
So we haven't tried this, mainly based on the observation in 2021 by Victor Miluski that this is not an approach that improves image captioning performance because the quality of automatically induced scene graphs is too low, and it ends up encoding the wrong information about the image, and then the model follows that and produces bad outputs, and that it's better just to work with the raw image directly through the vision transformer. But that was 2021. Maybe scene graph generation is much better now. I haven't followed the literature in that. So if it is substantially better, then it might help performance. But that's an empirical question that I haven't studied yet.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Hi. Oh my God. Well, so when you mentioned GPT-4o, it made me wonder. I haven't played around with the model that much myself. Maybe you have, because it seems like you're very interested in all of this. And as an expert on this topic, I was wondering if you have any reflections or comments or ideas about the multimodal performance of GPT-4o, and what do you think it could bring for the future of this area of multimodality in vision and language?
I haven't used GPT-4o at all. So Wenyan used it through their API to retrieve the results for this task. But personally, I haven't used it. I don't have a subscription to GPT. And your question is, what do I think it could bring? A lot of uncertainty about why we're suddenly performing really well in all of these tasks. I think so. One thing I've tried to convey this morning is an overview of open source and open weight models that people can use by themselves and break and understand by themselves. And I'm really passionate about that because I think this is where education and learning comes through as a PhD student or a practitioner in the field. I personally don't know what you learn by probing an API, except the model changed behind the scenes, and now it does better than it did before. I would love OpenAI to be more open and telling us much more details about how some of their processes work. I would love to know how they can do nearly instantaneous speech processing when you're communicating with a machine through the cloud. I would love for Google to tell us how they process 10 million input tokens in Gemini. I think we would all benefit greatly from that. And if you know somebody that works at Google, I would love you to encourage them or OpenAI to tell us more about this. Because I think that we can go so much further together if we know that. I didn't answer your question.
No. Okay, so let's thank Desmond again. And enjoy the lunch break.